A towering rancher with hands like sledgehammers never imagined that silence could speak louder than words, until a Cherokee girl who couldn't hear his voice taught him that the deepest conversations happen without sound. What started as the cruelest transaction would become the most beautiful proof that love needs no language, only understanding. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The Montana Territory stretched endless and unforgiving beneath a sky the color of old pewter, where wind carved stories into the snow that only the loneliest souls could read. February 1883 had settled over the land like a burial shroud, thick and suffocating, turning every breath into a visible prayer for warmth. The railroad town of Copper Falls hunched against the mountainside like a wounded animal, its few dozen buildings clustered together as if hoping their shared misery might somehow generate heat. Marcus Holloway stood 7 feet tall in his worn boots, a giant among men who cast shadows that seemed to swallow smaller folks whole. At 38, his shoulders spanned the width of a barn door, and his hands could cradle a newborn calf or snap a man's neck with equal ease. The thick beard that covered his jaw bore streaks of premature gray, earned through winters that had taken more from him than they'd given. His eyes, the color of storm clouds before lightning strikes, held the kind of emptiness that comes from burying dreams alongside the woman who'd carried them. Sarah Holloway had been dead 3 years, now claimed by consumption that no amount of prayer or medicine could cure. Their unborn child had followed her into the frozen ground of Copper Falls Cemetery, leaving Marcus with nothing but a ranch that felt more like a mausoleum and silence that echoed louder than any scream. He'd stopped talking to God somewhere, between the first shovel of dirt and the last nail in her coffin. What was the point of prayer when heaven seemed deaf to suffering? The trading post squatted at the end of Main Street like a carbuncle on the town's face, its weathered sign reading McKinnon's Goods and Services, in letters that had once been proud red, but now bled rust down the gray wood. Inside, the air hung thick with the smell of tobacco, leather, and desperation. Men gathered around the potbelly stove, their voices low and harsh as they discussed business that decent folks wouldn't mention in church. "That's something special today," announced Jeremiah McKinnon, a ferret-faced man whose smile revealed teeth like broken fence posts. His pale eyes glittered with the kind of greed that made honest men cross the street. "Something that'll solve your labor problems real permanent like." Marcus had come for horse feed, nothing more. His Mari Duchess was getting thin, and winter showed no signs of loosening its grip. But the men around the stove turned toward McKinnon with interest, their faces illuminated by flames that cast dancing shadows on walls lined with everything from ammunition to patent medicines. "What kind of something?" growled Buck Henley, a cattleman whose ranch bordered Marcus's property. Buck was built like a whiskey barrel, all gut and bluster, with hands that stayed too close to his pistol for most folks' comfort. McKinnon disappeared into the back room, his footsteps echoing against wooden planks. When he returned, he wasn't alone. The girl couldn't have been more than 16, though hardship had carved years into her face that shouldn't have been there. Her skin bore the warm bronze of Cherokee heritage, and her black hair hung in two braids that had once been carefully woven, but now looked neglected like everything else about her. She wore a dress that might have been blue once but had faded to the color of old bruises, patched in places with scraps that didn't match. Her feet were bare despite the cold, toes purple with frostbite that no one had bothered to tend, but it was her eyes that stopped Marcus cold. Dark as midnight, they held an alertness that seemed to take in everything at once, the leering faces of the men, the exits, the weapons, the subtle shifts in posture that spoke of danger. Yet there was something else in those eyes, something that made Marcus's chest tighten with unexpected recognition. It was the same look he'd seen in wounded animals, the ones that had given up fighting, but hadn't quite given up hoping. "This here's Luna," McKinnon announced, his hand gripping the girl's shoulder with possessive familiarity. "Real name's some Cherokee nonsense I can't pronounce, but Luna works fine for civilized folks. She's deaf as a post, which makes her perfect for certain kinds of work, if you catch my meaning." Several of the men chuckled, and Marcus felt something dark and violent stir in his belly. Luna's eyes flicked from face to face, reading expressions with an intelligence that belied McKinnon's casual dismissal of her as damaged goods. "Her daddy ran up quite a debt before the cholera took him," McKinnon continued, enjoying his audience. "Gambling debts mostly. Owed money to some very impatient gentlemen who don't care much for charity. They gave me her papers to settle what was owed, and now I'm passing that generosity along to you fine men." "Papers?" Marcus's voice came out rougher than he'd intended, drawing every eye in the room. "You got papers on a human being?" McKinnon's smile never wavered. "Legal as Sunday service, big man. Indenture contract, signed and witnessed. Perfectly legitimate way to handle unpaid debts. Girl's got 7 years left on her service, or until someone pays off what her daddy owed, whichever comes first." "How much?" The question came from Buck Henley, whose eyes had been crawling over Luna like hands. "And what exactly can she do besides look pretty?" "Strong as an ox despite her size," McKinnon replied, giving Luna a small shove that made her stumble. She caught herself without making a sound, her jaw set in a line that spoke of stubborn pride. "Deaf don't mean stupid, and Cherokee women know how to work. Can't complain about conditions, can't gossip with the neighbors, can't run to the law. With tailies, perfect worker really." Marcus watched Luna's face as the men discussed her like livestock. She couldn't hear the words, but she could read their intentions in their expressions, in the way they looked at her body instead of her eyes. Her hands moved in small, quick gestures, sign language, Marcus realized, though he couldn't understand what she was saying. It looked like prayers, or maybe curses. "Course, she's got other uses too," McKinnon added with a wink that made Marcus's hands curl into fists. "Young, healthy, easy on the eyes. Man gets lonely out on these ranches, and she can't exactly tell tales about how she's treated." The room erupted in laughter, except for Marcus. He stood like a mountain in their midst, silent and immovable, watching Luna's face cycle through emotions, anger, disgust, resignation, and underneath it all, a flicker of defiance that reminded him achingly of Sarah. "Starting bid is $50, McKinnon announced. "That's what her daddy owed, plus interest and my trouble in keeping her fed through winter." "50 for 7 years of work?" Buck whistled low. "Hell, I spend more than that on a good saddle." "Exactly my point," McKinnon grinned. "Investment that'll pay for itself inside a year, guaranteed." The bidding started slow. $40 from a farmer whose wife had died the previous spring. $45 from a merchant who owned the hotel and had very specific ideas about what services Luna could provide his guests. Buck Henley raised it to $55, his small eyes bright with anticipation. Marcus found himself studying Luna's hands. They were small but strong, calloused from work, scarred in places from burns or cuts that had healed without proper care. One finger had been broken and healed crooked. These weren't the soft hands of someone who'd been pampered or protected. They were the hands of a survivor. "60, called out a voice from the back of the room, and Marcus realized with surprise that it was his own voice. The room went quiet. McKinnon's eyebrows rose toward his receding hairline. Well, well. Didn't expect the Hermit of Copper Falls to join our little auction." 65, Buck countered immediately, his voice edged with irritation. Marcus had come here for horse feed. He had $47 in his pocket and a list of supplies he needed to get through the rest of winter. The smart thing would be to walk away, to let these men fight over their human prize while he minded his own business. Sarah was gone. His capacity for caring had been buried with her, or so he'd thought. But Luna's eyes found his across the smoky room. and something passed between them that had nothing to do with words or hearing. She tilted her head slightly, a question in her expression that he couldn't quite read, but somehow understood. It wasn't hope. Hope had probably been beaten out of her long ago. It was assessment. She was trying to figure out if he was different from the others, if the gentleness she sensed in his giant frame was real, or just another kind of trap. 70, he said, his voice carrying easily over the murmur of the crowd. Buck's face reddened. You got no use for her, Holloway. You don't even talk to folks anymore, let alone. 75, Marcus interrupted, his storm gray eyes never leaving Luna's face. She was watching him now with complete focus, her head tilted in that peculiar way deaf people often held themselves, as if listening with their entire bodies instead of just their ears. Her hands had stilled, no longer making those small, desperate gestures. 80. Buck slammed his fist on the counter, making several men jump. Luna didn't flinch. She couldn't hear the sound, but her eyes tracked to Buck's red face and angry posture, reading the violence there with practiced ease. Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch, hefting its weight. It contained every dollar he had in the world, plus a few coins that might push it over the edge. 100, he said quietly. The room erupted in whispers and curses. McKinnon's eyes went wide with greed and disbelief. Buck looked like he might draw his pistol, but even he wasn't fool enough to challenge Marcus Holloway to a fight. The big man's reputation was built on more than just his size. $100, McKinnon repeated, his voice cracking slightly. Going once, going twice, wait. Buck held up a hand, his face working through calculations. 110. Marcus felt the weight of the pouch in his hand. He was maybe $5 short of Buck's bid, and there was no way to get more money before someone else claimed Luna. The smart thing would be to let Buck win, to walk away and mind his own business. Instead, he looked at Luna again. She was studying his face with an intensity that made him feel exposed, as if she could see straight through to the broken places inside him that he kept carefully hidden. Her expression was unreadable, but her hands had started moving again. In those small, quick gestures. Marcus had never learned to read sign language, but somehow he understood what she was saying. Please. 120, he said, emptying the pouch onto McKinnon's counter. That's every dollar I got, but it's yours if you throw in a month's worth of horse feed. McKinnon's eyes lit up like Christmas morning. Buck cursed long and creative. But he didn't raise the bid. $120 was more money than most men in Copper Falls saw in 6 months. Sold to Marcus Holloway, McKinnon announced, scooping up the coins with greedy fingers. Pleasure doing business with you, big man. The crowd began to disperse, some grumbling about missing the show, others already planning how to separate Marcus from his new acquisition through card games or whiskey-fueled bargains. Buck Henley lingered near the door, his eyes promising that this wasn't over. Marcus approached Luna slowly, the way he might approach a wounded animal. Up close, he could see details that had been hidden by shadow and distance. Her dress was held together with careful stitches in thread that didn't match, suggesting she'd been mending it herself with whatever scraps she could find. There was a thin scar along her left temple, old but visible, and her lower lip bore the mark of recently healed split. She watched him approach without backing away, her chin raised in a gesture of defiance that couldn't quite hide her exhaustion. When he stopped in front of her, she was so small that the top of her head barely reached his chest. The contrast was almost comical, the giant and the sparrow except. There was nothing funny about the circumstances that had brought them together. Marcus had never felt more helpless in his life. He'd just spent his life savings on a girl he couldn't communicate with, for reasons he couldn't explain to himself. What was he supposed to do now? How did you care for someone when you couldn't even ask them what they needed? Luna's hands moved. Again, quick gestures that painted meaning in the air between them. Her expression was patient but urgent. as if she was trying to tell him something important. When he didn't respond, she tried again, more slowly, her dark eyes searching his face for any sign of understanding. Finally, she gave up on sign language and instead reached out with one small scarred hand to touch his wrist. The contact was brief but electric, sending an unexpected jolt through his system. She pointed to herself, then to him, then toward the door, her eyebrows raised in a question. Marcus nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said, knowing she couldn't hear him but hoping she might read his lips or at least understand his tone. "You're coming." "With me." Relief flickered across her features, followed immediately by wariness. She'd learned not to trust relief, he realized. Good fortune in her world usually came with a price that wasn't worth paying. McKinnon appeared at Marcus's elbow, holding out a folded piece of paper. "Her indenture contract," he explained. "Legal proof of ownership, plus a list of her capabilities. Take good care of her, Holloway. That's a fine piece of property you just acquired." Marcus took the paper without looking at it, fighting the urge to punch McKinnon in his sneering face. Instead, he tucked the contract into his coat pocket and turned toward Luna. She was watching the exchange with that same intense focus, reading the dynamics between the two men even without hearing their words. "Come on," Marcus said, gesturing toward the door. "Let's get out of here." Luna gathered her skirts and followed him outside into the bitter February air. The wind hit them like a physical blow, driving snow horizontal across the muddy street. Marcus pulled his heavy coat tighter, but Luna had no protection beyond her thin dress. She wrapped her arms around herself and kept walking, her bare feet making no sound on the frozen ground. Marcus stopped short, cursing himself for his thoughtlessness. Here he was, trying to be her savior, and he was already failing at the basic task of keeping her from freezing to death. He shrugged out of his coat and held it out to her. Luna stared at the offered garment, as if it might bite her. Her eyes flicked from the coat to his face, searching for the trap she was sure must be hidden somewhere. Men didn't give things to girls like her without expecting payment in return, and she'd learned to be suspicious of kindness that came too easy. Marcus waited, holding the coat steady despite the wind that was already cutting through his flannel shirt like ice water. His teeth were starting to chatter, but he didn't lower his arms. Finally, Luna reached out and took the coat, pulling it around her small frame. It swallowed her completely, the hem dragging in the snow, but it was warm and it smelled like honest work instead of whiskey and violence. "Thank you," she said, her voice rusty from disuse but clearly understandable. Marcus blinked in surprise. "I thought you were ... Luna pointed to her ears and shook her head, then pointed to her mouth and nodded. The message was clear. She couldn't hear, but she could speak. It was the first time her voice had been heard in McKinnon's trading post. Probably because no one had ever bothered to ask her opinion about anything. "Can you ... double quotes?" Marcus paused, unsure how to phrase the question. "Do you read lips?" Luna nodded, then held up her hand with fingers spread, rocking it slightly. Sometimes the gesture seemed to say, "Depends on the person." They walked through the town in companionable silence, their breath creating small clouds that the wind immediately stole away. Copper Falls was never a welcoming place, but today it felt especially hostile. Eyes followed them from windows and doorways, the giant rancher and his new acquisition, already the subject of speculation and gossip that would fuel conversations for weeks to come. Marcus's horse and wagon waited at the hitching post outside the general store, Duchess stamping her feet and snorting impatiently in the cold. The mare was a gentle giant like her owner, a Clydesdale mix with feet like dinner plates and a disposition as calm as summer pond. She nickered softly when she saw Marcus approach, her ears pricked forward with interest at the sight of Luna. Luna approached the horse slowly, her hands visible and non-threatening. She'd clearly been around animals before and knew how to read their moods. Duchess lowered her massive head, allowing Luna to stroke her nose with gentle fingers. "She likes you," Marcus observed, climbing up onto the wagon seat. Luna smiled for the first time since he'd seen her, an expression that transformed her entire face from merely pretty to genuinely beautiful. She pointed to herself, then to Duchess, then made a series of gestures that Marcus interpreted as some kind of communication between girl and horse. "Can you ... Marcus started to ask if she could climb up on her own, then realized how stupid the question was. Luna had been surviving on her own resources for who knew how long. She didn't need his help to get into a wagon. She proved him right by gathering the oversized coat around her legs and scrambling up onto the seat beside him with surprising grace. The wagon tilted slightly under Marcus's weight when he settled back down, but Luna barely made an impression on the sturdy bench as they rolled out of town. Marcus found himself stealing glances at his unexpected passenger. She sat straight and alert, her eyes scanning the landscape around them with the same intensity she'd shown in the trading post. Everything about her posture suggested someone accustomed to watching for danger, ready to run or fight or disappear at a moment's notice. The Holloway Ranch lay 15 miles outside Copper Falls, accessible only by a winding trail that cut through pine forest and across 2 frozen creeks. It was isolated enough that Marcus could go weeks without seeing another soul, which had suited him fine since Sarah's death. But now, with Luna sitting beside him in the gathering dusk, the loneliness of the place felt different. Not comfortable anymore, but not exactly unwelcome either. Just uncertain. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The Holloway Ranch emerged from the pine shadows like something carved from the mountain, its self-weathered gray buildings that seemed to grow directly from the frozen earth. The main house stood 2 stories tall, its windows dark and uninviting, while the barn stretched long and low beside it like a sleeping beast. Smoke drifted from the stone chimney, the only sign that life still stirred within these walls. Luna took in every detail with those sharp, observant eyes of hers. The way the fence posts leaned at odd angles, some missing entirely. The rust streaking down the barn's metal roof like old blood. The garden plot behind the house, now buried under snow but clearly abandoned long before winter arrived. This was the home of a man who had stopped caring about appearances, who maintained only what was necessary for survival. Marcus guided Duchess around to the barn, where golden lamplight spilled through the open doors. Inside, the building was surprisingly well-kept, stalls cleaned and bedded with fresh straw, tools hanging in neat rows, feed bins topped off and secure. Whatever demons haunted Marcus Holloway, he still took proper care of his animals. "You can sleep in the loft," Marcus said as he unhitched Duchess, his words visible in the cold air. "It's warm enough, and there's blankets up there." Luna nodded, but her eyes were already exploring the barn's interior. She moved with the quiet efficiency of someone accustomed to making quick assessments of new spaces, where to hide if necessary, what could be used as weapons, which routes offered the best escape. Her survival instincts had been honed by experiences. Marcus could only guess at as he began brushing down Duchess. Marcus found himself watching Luna from the corner of his eye. She discovered a tabby cat curled up in one of the empty stalls, and to his surprise, she knelt down and began signing to the animal. The cat, predictably, ignored her gestures, but seemed to appreciate the gentle tone of her voice when she whispered words Marcus couldn't quite catch. "That's Ginger," Marcus said, raising his voice slightly and making sure she could see his face. "She's a good mouser, but she's not much for company." Luna looked up at him with a small smile, then back at the cat. Her hands moved again, sign language that Marcus was beginning to recognize as her natural way of processing thoughts, even when no one could understand her. It was like watching someone think out loud, except the language was visual instead of audible. When Marcus finished with Duchess, he led Luna to the wooden ladder that climbed to the hayloft. The upper level was surprisingly cozy bales of hay stacked to form natural windbreaks, thick horse blankets folded in a corner, and a small pot-bellied stove that connected to the main chimney system. Someone had set this space up as living quarters before, though it had clearly been unused for some time. Sarah used to come up here when she wanted to be alone, Marcus found himself saying, then immediately regretted the words. He hadn't spoken his dead wife's name aloud in over a year, and certainly not to a stranger who couldn't even hear it properly. But Luna was watching his face with that intense focus of hers, and somehow she understood. She touched his arm gently, then pressed her hand over her own heart in a gesture that transcended language. "I'm sorry for your loss." Her expression seemed to say. Marcus cleared his throat roughly and turned away before the unexpected sympathy could crack something inside him that needed to stay sealed. "There's a chamber pot behind that bale there," he said gruffly. "I'll bring you some food when it's ready." He climbed down the ladder faster than necessary, leaving Luna alone in the loft. But as he walked toward the house, he could feel her watching him through the small window, and the sensation was oddly comforting rather than intrusive. It had been a long time since another human being had paid attention to his comings and goings. The house felt even emptier than usual when Marcus stepped inside. Sarah's presence had once filled these rooms with warmth and laughter, but now they echoed with his footsteps like the chambers of a tomb. The main room held a stone fireplace, a dining table built from thick pine, and chairs that rarely saw use anymore. The kitchen adjoined it, functional but sparse, containing only what a man needed to keep himself fed and nothing more. Marcus built up the fire and began preparing supper salt pork, beans, and cornbread that would have to do until he could get to town again for proper supplies. As he worked, his mind kept drifting to the girl in his barn. What was he supposed to do with her? He'd bought her on impulse, driven by some protective instinct he'd thought had died with Sarah, but now the reality of the situation was settling in like morning frost. She was 16 years old, alone in the world, and completely dependent on his goodwill. The indenture contract in his coat pocket made her legally his responsibility for the next 7 years, but Marcus had never wanted to own another human being. The whole concept sat in his stomach like spoiled meat. Outside, snow began falling. Again, fat flakes that caught the lamplight and swirled in complex patterns. Marcus found himself wondering if Luna could see the snow from her window, if she found beauty in its silent dance, or only saw another barrier to potential escape. Everything about her suggested a person who had learned to find danger in beauty, to suspect kindness as just another form of trap. When the food was ready, Marcus loaded a plate and wrapped it in a clean towel to keep it warm. The walk back to the barn felt longer than usual, weighted down by uncertainty and the strange responsibility he'd taken on. Luna was sitting by the small stove when he climbed up to the loft, her borrowed coat folded neatly beside her and her hair rebraided with careful precision. She accepted the plate with a nod of thanks, but Marcus noticed she didn't begin eating immediately. Instead, she waited, watching his face with that careful attention that seemed to be her default expression. It took him a moment to realize she was waiting for permission, or perhaps for him to reveal what he expected in return. For the food. "Go ahead," Marcus said, making sure she could see his lips. "You must be hungry." Luna ate with the controlled desperation of someone who had learned not to waste food, cleaning the plate thoroughly, but not so quickly as to appear greedy. When she finished, she set the plate aside and looked at Marcus expectantly, her posture straight and alert. She was waiting for instructions, he realized, waiting to learn what her duties would be, what services he expected from her. The thought made Marcus's chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't quite name. Anger, maybe, at a world that had taught a 16-year-old girl to expect nothing but exploitation from the men who held power over her. Or perhaps it was grief for the innocence that had been stripped away from someone who should have been learning to dance at church socials. instead of reading the intentions of men who saw her as property. "You don't have to do anything tonight," Marcus said carefully, choosing his words with more thought than he'd given to speech in years. "Just rest. We'll figure out the rest tomorrow." Luna's eyebrows rose slightly, and she tilted her head in that characteristic way of hers. Her hands moved in quick, questioning gestures, and Marcus found himself wishing desperately that he could understand what she was trying to say. "I don't know sign language," he admitted, feeling suddenly foolish. Never had cause to learn it. Luna studied his face for a moment, then reached into the folds of her dress and pulled out a small piece of charcoal, the kind used for drawing or writing. She looked around the loft until she spotted a piece of flat wood leaning against one of the hay bales, part of an old crate that had been broken down for kindling. Moving with quick efficiency, Luna began writing on the wood in careful block letters. "What do you want from me?" The directness of the question hit Marcus like a physical blow. She'd gotten straight to the heart of the matter, cutting through any pretense or polite conversation to the fundamental issue that lay between them. What did he want from her? He'd spent $120 he couldn't afford on a girl he couldn't communicate with, and he still didn't have a clear answer to that question. Marcus took the charcoal from her fingers, his rough hands careful not to hurt her smaller ones. On the same piece of wood, below her question, he wrote, "Nothing. You are safe here." Luna stared at the words for a long moment, her dark eyes moving from the letters to his face and back again. Then she took the charcoal back and wrote, "Men always want something." The simple statement carried the weight of hard-earned experience, and Marcus felt something dark and violent stir in his chest at the implications. What had been done to this girl to make her so certain that kindness always came with a price? What had she endured in the months or years since her father's death? He wrote, "Not all men, not me." Luna read his words, then looked at him with an expression that was equal parts hope and skepticism. She'd heard promises before, he realized. She'd probably believed them once too, before life taught her that words were cheap and actions were the only true measure of a person's character. Instead of writing another response, Luna set the charcoal aside and pointed to herself then, to the hay-filled corner where she'd clearly planned to sleep. The message was clear. She'd take his word for now, but she'd be ready to defend herself if his promises proved false. "Good night, Luna," Marcus said, though he knew she couldn't hear the words. He hoped she could read the gentleness in his expression, the sincerity he was trying to project. She nodded once, a formal little gesture that reminded him again how young she was, despite the old wisdom in her eyes. As Marcus climbed back down the ladder, he could hear the soft rustle of hay as she arranged her bedding, the small sounds of someone settling in for another night of weary sleep. Back in the house, Marcus sat by the fire with a cup of coffee gone cold in his hands. The flames danced hypnotically, casting shifting shadows on the walls where Sarah's things still gathered dust on the shelves. Her books, her sewing basket, the small wooden cross her mother had carved for their wedding day. He'd been unable to pack them away, but now their presence felt different. Less like shrines to the dead and more like reminders of what it meant to care for someone, to build a life with another person. The wind picked up outside, rattling the windows and sending snow swirling past the glass in ghostly patterns. Marcus found himself wondering if Luna was warm enough in the loft, if she was afraid of the sounds the old barn made in the wind, if she was planning to run at first light, or if some part of her actually believed his promise that she was safe here. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. The townspeople would want to know what he planned to do with his expensive acquisition. Buck Henley would probably come around, testing to see if Marcus's resolve had weakened overnight. And Marcus would have to figure out how to bridge the communication gap between himself and a girl who spoke in gestures he couldn't understand. But tonight, for the first time in 3 years, Marcus Holloway wasn't entirely alone on his mountain. There was another heartbeat sharing the rhythm of his world, another soul seeking shelter from the storm. It wasn't the same as having Sarah back, Nothing could ever be that, but it was something. A small flame of purpose in the endless winter of his grief. Outside, the wind continued its lonely song through the pines, but somehow the sound seemed less desolate than before. Snow covered the tracks they'd made walking from house to barn, erasing the evidence of their passage. But the connection between them remained. Fragile as spider silk, perhaps, but real nonetheless. In the loft above the horses, Luna lay awake listening to sounds she could only feel through vibration, the settling of the barn's timbers, the soft nickering of the animals below, the distant howl of wind through the mountains. She'd written the truth in charcoal on that piece of wood. Men always wanted something from girls like her. The question was what Marcus Holloway's price would be, and whether she'd be strong enough to pay it when the time came. But for now, wrapped in horse blankets that smelled of honest work instead of stale whiskey, Luna allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, she'd finally found a place where she could lower her guard long enough to remember what it felt like to be 16 instead of ancient. Dawn crept over the Montana peaks like a thief carrying light in its pockets, spilling silver across the snow-covered ranch with reluctant generosity. Marcus woke to silence so complete it felt unnatural, no creaking floorboards from above, no sounds of movement in the kitchen. For a moment, panic seized his chest with iron fingers. Had Luna run during the night? Had she decided that even the bitter cold was preferable to whatever unknown dangers his kindness might conceal? He dressed quickly in the pre-dawn darkness, his breath forming small clouds as he pulled on wool socks and heavy boots. The house felt tomb-like in its emptiness, every shadow hiding the possibility that he'd failed before he'd even truly begun. Outside, fresh snow had fallen, nearly 6 inches of pristine white that showed no footprints leading away from the barn. Either Luna was still here, or she was clever enough to cover her tracks. The barn doors stood slightly ajar, which wasn't unusual. Marcus often left them that way for ventilation. But as he stepped inside, he froze. The familiar space had been transformed. Every tool hung in perfect alignment. The stalls were mucked and fresh straw laid down, water troughs filled, and the floors swept clean. Even Duchess's coat gleamed with the kind of careful grooming that spoke of patience and skill. From the loft above came the soft sound of humming wordless melody that seemed to float through the morning air like incense. Marcus had never heard anything more beautiful in his life. He climbed the ladder quietly, not wanting to startle Luna, and found her sitting cross-legged on her makeshift bed with something spread across her lap. As his head cleared the loft floor, she looked up and offered a small smile that was equal parts shy and proud. In her hands was his torn work shirt, the one he'd ripped on a nail 3 weeks ago, and hadn't bothered to mend. The tear had been carefully sewn with tiny, precise stitches using thread she must have pulled from the hem of her own dress. Repair was so neat it was nearly invisible, transforming the damaged garment into something better than it had been before. But that wasn't what made Marcus's throat tighten with unexpected emotion. Luna had embroidered a small design around the mended area, a delicate pattern of pine, branches and snowflakes worked in blue thread that must have come from somewhere in her dress's construction. It was beautiful, but more than that, it was a gift. She'd taken his broken thing and made it into something worth treasuring. "You didn't have to do that," Marcus said, accepting the shirt with hands that shook slightly. Luna tilted her head and gave him a look that suggested she understood his meaning, even if she couldn't hear his words. Then she reached for her piece of charcoal and the makeshift writing board. In careful letters she wrote, "You gave me shelter, I give what I can." Marcus studied the words, then looked around the immaculately cleaned barn. "You did all this before sunrise?" Luna nodded, then wrote, "Sleep little. Work helps me think. What do you think about?" Marcus wrote back, surprised by his own curiosity. Luna's expression grew thoughtful, and she took her time forming the words. "How to understand you. How to be useful without being afraid." The honesty of her answer hit Marcus like cold water. She was trying to figure out how to survive in his world, just as he was trying to figure out how to make room for her in it. They were both navigating uncharted territory, feeling their way through darkness towards something neither of them could quite name. "You don't have to be afraid of me," Marcus wrote carefully. Luna read his words, then looked directly into his eyes with an intensity that made him feel exposed. She wrote, "You say that, but I have seen good men become different when they think nitrogen monoxide, one is watching." The statement carried the weight of bitter experience, and Marcus felt anger stir in his chest, not at Luna, but at whoever had taught her such caution. What kind of good men had she encountered who revealed their true nature only in private moments? Instead of writing a response, Marcus stood and walked to the loft window. The sun was fully up now, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of gold and pink. It was going to be a beautiful day, the kind that made a person believe winter might actually end someday. "Can you ride a horse?" Marcus asked, turning back to Luna and speaking slowly so she could read his lips. Luna nodded, though there was a question in her eyes. "I need to check on the cattle today," Marcus explained. "They're in the south pasture, about 2 miles from here. You could come with me if you want. Fresh air might do you good." Luna considered this, her dark eyes studying his face for any hidden motives. Finally she wrote, "Why would you want me to come?" It was a fair question, and Marcus found himself struggling to articulate an answer that made sense. The truth was, he'd grown accustomed to solitude over the past 3 years. He did his ranch work alone, ate his meals in silence, and rarely spoke more than a dozen words in any given day. But this morning, the thought of riding out across his land with Luna beside him felt right somehow. "Because you shouldn't have to spend your days locked in a barn like a prisoner," Marcus wrote finally. "And because I think you'd like to see the mountains from horseback." Luna stared at his words for a long moment, then wrote, "I have never seen mountains from anywhere but the ground." "Then it's time you did," Marcus replied, speaking the words aloud, even though she couldn't hear them. An hour later, they rode out together into the crystalline morning. Marcus had saddled his gentlest mare, a dun-colored quarter horse named Sage, for Luna to ride. To his surprise and admiration, she'd mounted the horse with the easy confidence of someone who'd been riding since childhood, whatever hardships Luna had endured. She'd clearly grown up around horses. They rode in comfortable silence through snow-laden pine forests and across meadows that sparkled like fields of diamonds. Luna sat her horse like she'd been born in the saddle, her posture relaxed but alert, taking in everything around her with that characteristic intensity. When they crested a ridge that offered a panoramic view of the valley below, she pulled Sage to a halt and simply stared. The sight was breathtaking, a vast expanse of snow-covered ranchland stretching to the foothills, where Marcus's cattle moved like dark specks against the white. Beyond them, the Rocky Mountains rose in majesty that seemed to dwarf human concerns, their peaks catching the morning light and throwing it back in sheets of gold and silver. Luna's hands moved in what Marcus was beginning to recognize as her private sign language, quick gestures that seemed to capture thoughts too complex for writing or speech. Her face was radiant with wonder, transformed from the wary survivor he'd met yesterday into someone young enough to be awed by natural beauty. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Marcus said, though he knew she couldn't hear him. But Luna turned to look at him, and somehow she understood. She nodded emphatically, then pointed to the mountains and made a gesture that seemed to encompass the entire landscape. Her meaning was clear. This was more beautiful than anything she'd ever imagined. They spent the morning checking on the cattle, riding through snow that reached the horses' bellies in some places. Luna proved to be naturally helpful, anticipating what needed to be done and positioning herself to be most useful without needing direction. When they found a cow struggling to break through ice to reach water, she dismounted immediately and began clearing the frozen surface with a stick while Marcus worked on the other side. It was during their lunch break, sitting on a fallen log and sharing sandwiches Marcus had packed, that Luna made her first real attempt at extended conversation. She pulled out her charcoal and writing board and began forming careful letters. "Your wife, was she like the mountains?" Marcus paused, with his sandwich halfway to his mouth, surprised by the question. No one had asked him about Sarah in over a year. Most people in Copper Falls had learned to avoid the subject entirely, treating his grief like a contagious disease that might spread if acknowledged directly. "What do you mean?" He wrote back. Luna considered her words carefully. "Beautiful in a way that made you want to look even when I teherit." The accuracy of her description took Marcus's breath away. That was exactly what loving Sarah had been like, a beauty so intense it was almost painful to witness, like staring at the sun or watching lightning split the sky. Even now, 3 years after her death, thinking about Sarah carried that same mixture of joy and anguish. "Yes," Marcus wrote simply, "exactly like that." Luna nodded as if she'd expected as much. Then she wrote, "I am sorry she is gone. The mountains are still here for you to love." The observation was so unexpected, so quietly profound, that Marcus felt something crack open in his chest. For 3 years, he'd avoided looking at the beauty around him because it reminded him too much of what he'd lost. But Luna was right. The mountains were still here, still magnificent, still worthy of love, even if that love carried the echo of loss. "How did you know?" Marcus wrote, his own handwriting shakier than usual. Luna was quiet for a long time, staring out at the snow-covered peaks. Finally, she wrote, "My father used to say the world keeps its beauty even when our hearts are broken. Maybe especially then." They rode back to the ranch in thoughtful silence, both lost in their own reflections. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, the snow took on a blue tinge that made the familiar landscape look like something from a fairy tale. Luna rode with her face turned toward the mountains, as if she was memorizing every detail of their stark beauty. That evening, as Marcus prepared dinner, he found himself humming the same wordless melody he'd heard from Luna that morning. The sound surprised him. He hadn't hummed or sung since Sarah's funeral. But somehow, Luna's presence in his world had awakened something in him that he'd thought was permanently silenced. When he brought Luna's dinner to the loft, he found her sitting by the small stove with her charcoal and writing board in her lap. She'd been working on something while he cooked, not words this time, but a drawing. It showed the view from the ridge that morning, the valley spread out below, the cattle moving like tiny shadows, and the mountains rising beyond it all in majestic splendor. But it was more than just a landscape drawing. Luna had somehow captured the feeling of that moment, the sense of vastness and possibility, the way the beauty had made both of them feel small and significant at the same time. It was the work of someone with real artistic talent, and Marcus found himself studying the details with growing amazement. "This is incredible," Marcus said, holding the drawing carefully. "You're an artist." Luna smiled and wrote, "My grandmother taught me. She said pictures are another kind of language." "She was right," Marcus wrote back. "This says more than 1,000 words could." Luna looked pleased by his praise, but then her expression grew more serious. She wrote, "I want to learn your language too, the one with hands." It took Marcus a moment to understand what she meant. "Sign language? You want to teach me sign language?" Luna nodded eagerly, then began moving her hands in slow, deliberate gestures. She pointed to herself, then made a sign that looked like she was drawing something in the air. Next, she pointed to Marcus and made a different gesture, hands moving like they were chopping wood. "Your name sign and my name sign?" Marcus guessed. Luna nodded and repeated the gestures, then wrote, "Luna like moon moving across sky. Marcus like strong hands working." Over the next hour, Luna began teaching Marcus the basic alphabet in American Sign Language. guiding his large hands through the finger positions needed to spell out words. His fingers felt clumsy and oversized compared to her delicate movements, but Luna was patient, correcting his mistakes with gentle touches and encouraging smiles. As the fire burned low and shadows danced on the loft walls, Marcus realized something had fundamentally shifted between them. They were no longer stranger and property, or even rescuer and rescued. They were two people learning to speak each other's languages, building bridges across the silence that had separated them. For the first time since Sarah's death, Marcus felt the stirring of something that might eventually become hope. 3 weeks had passed since Luna's arrival at the Holloway Ranch, and the rhythm of their daily life had settled into something that felt almost natural. Marcus woke each morning to find evidence of Luna's quiet industry: firewood split and stacked, water hauled from the well, small repairs completed with meticulous care. She moved through her tasks like a ghost, leaving no trace except the improved state of everything she touched. The communication lessons had become their evening ritual. After supper, they would sit by the loft's small stove while Luna guided Marcus through increasingly complex sign language. His massive hands were learning to speak in graceful movements, though he still fumbled with the more intricate gestures that came so naturally to her. Luna was endlessly patient, her dark eyes lighting up with genuine joy whenever he successfully mastered a new word or phrase. "You're getting better," Luna signed one evening, her movements fluid and expressive. Marcus understood her perfectly now, without needing written words for simple conversations. "Still slow," Marcus replied in sign, his fingers deliberate, but improving, like Bear trying to dance. Luna's laughter was a sound Marcus had grown to treasure, rare, but genuine, bubbling up from some protected place inside her that was slowly learning to trust again. She signed back, "Bears can dance. I saw one once by the river when I was small." "Really?" Marcus asked aloud, forgetting for a moment that she couldn't hear him. He caught himself and switched to sign. "Tell me." Luna's expression grew wistful as she began to sign the story. Her hands painted pictures in the air, a young Cherokee girl hiding behind bushes, watching a massive black bear rear up on its hind legs and sway back and forth in what could only be described as dancing. Her father had told her the bear was celebrating the salmon run, expressing joy in the only way it knew how. "I wanted to dance with him," Luna signed, her smile soft with memory, "but my father pulled me away." Sighed bears dance alone. Not always. Marcus found himself signing before he could think better of it. Sometimes bears find partners. The words hung between them in the warm air of the loft, carrying implications neither of them was quite ready to examine. Luna's cheeks flushed pink, and she looked down at her hands, suddenly shy. Marcus felt heat creep up his own neck and busied himself poking at the fire with unnecessary vigor. It was during the 4th week that the weather turned vicious. A blizzard roared down from the peaks with the fury of something personal, burying the ranch under 3 feet of snow and driving the temperature so low that water froze in the pipes, despite the fires burning constantly. Marcus strung rope between the house and barn to avoid getting lost in the whiteout conditions, and for 4 days they barely saw each other except for the brief moments when he brought food to the loft. On the 5th day, when the storm finally broke, Marcus discovered that one of his prize breeding bulls had gotten trapped in a gully nearly half a mile from the main pasture. The animal was weak from cold and unable to climb out on its own, and Marcus knew he'd need help to save it. Under normal circumstances, he would have ridden to town for assistance, but the roads were impassable after the blizzard. Luna read the worry in his expression immediately when he returned from his morning check on the livestock. She watched as he gathered rope and tools, preparing for what was clearly a difficult rescue operation. "What's wrong?" She signed. Marcus explained the situation, expecting Luna to nod sympathetically and return to her tasks. Instead, she stood up and began pulling on her heavy coat, the one Marcus had bought her in town the week before when he'd noticed her thin dress was no protection against the mountain cold. "I come with you," Luna signed decisively. "Too dangerous." Marcus protested. "Bull is scared, might charge. You stay here where it's safe." Luna's chin lifted in that stubborn gesture he was learning to recognize. Two people better than one. "I'm strong, and I understand animals." She was right about understanding animals. Marcus had watched her gentle way with Duchess and the barn cats, the intuitive connection she seemed to have with any creature that crossed her path. But the idea of putting Luna in danger made his chest tighten with protective instincts he wasn't ready to examine too closely. "I don't want you hurt," Marcus signed, his movements clumsy with emotion. "I don't want you hurt." "Either," Luna replied, her dark eyes serious. "Together we both stay safe." In the end, it was her logic that won the argument. The bull weighed nearly a ton, and getting it out of the gully would require careful coordination between multiple people. Luna was right, two people working together had a much better chance of success than one person working alone. They rode out together through snow that came up to the horses' chests, following the trail Marcus had broken that morning. The silence of the post-blizzard landscape was absolute. No bird songs, no wind, just the muffled crunch of hooves through powder and the clouds of breath from both horses and riders. When they reached the gully, they found the bull exactly where Marcus had left him, a massive Hereford with rust-colored fur and worried eyes, standing belly-deep in snow at the bottom of a natural depression that had become a frozen prison. The animal was alert but clearly exhausted from his attempts to escape. "He's beautiful," Luna signed, studying the bull with professional interest. "But scared. We need to calm him first." Marcus had planned to simply throw ropes around the bull and try to haul him out using brute force and the horse's strength. But Luna had a different approach. She dismounted Sage and approached the edge of the gully slowly, her hands visible and non-threatening. Then she began to sing. Marcus had heard Luna hum before, but never anything like this. Her voice rose clear and strong in the crystalline air, carrying a melody that seemed to be woven from the mountains themselves. It was a Cherokee song. He realized, something passed down through generations of her people, carrying the wisdom of those who had lived in harmony with wild creatures for centuries. Beyond counting, the effect on the bull was immediate and dramatic. The animal's head turned toward Luna's voice, his ears pricked forward with interest rather than fear. His breathing slowed, and the tension went out of his massive shoulders. Within minutes, the bull was standing calmly, watching Luna with the trusting expression of a creature that recognized a friend. "How did you know to do that?" Marcus signed when Luna paused in her singing. "My grandmother taught me," Luna replied. She said animals remember the first songs they ever heard, before humans forgot how to speak their language. Working together, with Luna's calming presence and Marcus's physical strength, they managed to fashion a harness system that would allow the horses to pull the bull up the sloping side of the gully without injuring him. Luna positioned herself where the bull could see her, continuing her soft singing while Marcus worked with the ropes. It took 2 hours of careful, patient work, but eventually the massive animal scrambled up onto level ground, shaking snow from his coat and lowing with what sounded like gratitude. He stood for a moment, looking between Marcus and Luna as if acknowledging their help, before trotting off toward the main herd with dignity intact. "We did it," Luna signed, her face bright with triumph and cold-flushed cheeks. "You did it," Marcus corrected. "Without your singing, he would have fought us. Might have hurt himself worse." Luna shook her head. "We both did it, like partners." The word hung between them as they rode home through the golden light of late afternoon. Partners. It suggested equality, mutual respect, shared purpose. It was a far cry from the master and property relationship that the indenture contract in Marcus's coat pocket legally defined. That evening, as they sat in the barn sharing a bottle of whiskey Marcus had brought to celebrate their successful Rescue. Luna pulled out her charcoal and writing board. But instead of words, she began sketching quick, sure strokes that captured the bull's rescue in vivid detail. The drawing showed Marcus and Luna working in perfect coordination, their combined efforts freeing the trapped animal. But it was more than just a record of the day's events. Luna had somehow captured the moment when they'd stopped being rescuer and rescued and become something else entirely. Two people choosing to face danger together, trusting each other with their safety, celebrating their shared victory. "Frame this," Marcus said, studying the drawing with growing amazement. "This should be on the wall where people can see it." Luna looked surprised by the suggestion. "It's just a drawing." "No," Marcus signed carefully. "It's proof. Proof that we make a good team." The next morning brought unexpected visitors. Marcus was splitting wood behind the house when he spotted 3 riders approaching through the snow. Sheriff Tom Bradley, accompanied by 2 men Marcus didn't recognize. The sheriff's face was grim, and his companions wore the kind of hard expressions that suggested official business of an unpleasant nature. Luna saw them coming too, and Marcus watched her entire demeanor shift. The easy confidence she'd shown during the bull rescue vanished, replaced by the wary tension of a hunted animal. She retreated toward the barn, but not before Marcus caught her eye and signed, "Stay close, I'll handle this." "Marcus Holloway," Sheriff Bradley called as he dismounted. "These gentlemen are federal marshals. They'd like to ask you some questions about the girl you bought from McKinnon." Marcus's blood ran cold. "What kind of questions?" One of the marshals stepped forward, a lean man with steel-gray hair and eyes like chips of flint. "Marshal Davis, Federal Bureau of Indian Affairs. We're investigating reports of illegal indenture contracts involving Cherokee citizens. I understand you recently acquired a young woman of Cherokee descent. Luna's working off her father's debt." Marcus said carefully, "Everything's legal and documented." "That's what we're here to determine," Marshal Davis replied. "The Cherokee Nation has been filing complaints about tribal members being sold into indentured servitude without proper legal authority. If Miss Littlefeather is a registered member of the tribe, her indenture contract may be invalid under federal law." Marcus felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. Littlefeather, that must be Luna's real surname, the Cherokee name McKinnon. Couldn't be bothered to pronounce. And if the marshals were here to investigate, it meant Luna might be taken away, returned to whatever situation she'd been rescued from. "She's safe here," Marcus said, his voice harder than he'd intended. "Well cared for, not mistreated." "I'm sure she is," Marshal Davis said diplomatically. "But the law is the law. We'll need to speak with her directly, determine her tribal status, and whether she entered into this arrangement voluntarily." Marcus's hands clenched into fists at his sides. He thought about Luna's fear of men in authority, her hard-earned wariness of anyone who claimed to have her best interests at heart. The idea of these strangers interrogating her, possibly taking her away from the first place she'd felt safe in years, filled him with protective fury. But before he could respond, Luna herself appeared at the barn door. She walked toward the group with careful dignity, her chin raised and her hands steady, despite what Marcus knew must be terror. When she reached them, she looked directly at Marshal Davis and spoke in a clear, strong voice. "I am Luna Littlefeather of the Cherokee Nation," she said, her words precise despite the slight accent that marked English as her second language. "And I choose to stay here." The silence that followed Luna's declaration stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Marshal Davis studied her with calculating eyes, taking in her straight posture, the defiant tilt of her chin, the way she stood slightly closer to Marcus than to the federal agents. Sheriff Bradley shifted uncomfortably in his saddle, clearly wishing he were anywhere else. "Miss Littlefeather," Marshal Davis said carefully, "I need you to understand that your current legal status may not be legitimate. If your indenture contract was signed without proper Cherokee Nation oversight, you may have rights you're not aware of." Luna's hands moved in quick, sharp gestures, sign language that Marcus recognized as agitation, though he couldn't understand the specific words. She was asking him something, her dark eyes urgent with questions she couldn't voice in front of these strangers who might use her words against her. She wants to know what happens if the contract is invalid, Marcus interpreted, stepping closer to Luna in a gesture of solidarity that didn't go unnoticed by the marshals. If the contract is deemed illegal, Miss Littlefeather would be free to leave, Marshal Davis explained. The Cherokee Nation has established a relief fund to help displaced tribal members return home or relocate to areas with Cherokee communities. Marcus felt something cold and sharp twist in his chest. Free to leave. The words should have brought relief. Luna deserved freedom, deserved choices, deserved better than being legally bound to a grieving rancher who was still learning how to be human again. But the thought of watching her ride away, of returning to the hollow silence that had defined his life before her arrival, filled him with a desperation he hadn't felt since Sarah's death. Luna was studying his face with that intense focus of hers, reading emotions he wasn't skilled enough to hide. Whatever she saw there made her expression soften with understanding and something else, something that looked almost like regret. "May I speak with Mr. Holloway privately?" Luna asked, her voice steady despite the tremor Marcus could see in her hands. Marshal Davis nodded. "We'll wait by the house. Take your time." As the lawmen withdrew to a respectful distance, Luna turned to Marcus and began signing rapidly. Her movements were urgent, emotional, carrying weight that mere words couldn't convey. "Slow down," Marcus signed back, his own fingers clumsy with stress. "I can't follow when you sign so fast." Luna took a deep breath and began again, more slowly. "They want to save me. But I don't need saving anymore." "You should be free," Marcus replied, though each gesture felt like he was signing his own sentence. "You deserve choice." "I am choosing," Luna signed emphatically. "I choose this place. I choose." The last sign was almost hesitant, as if she wasn't sure she had the right to make such a declaration. But her eyes were fierce with certainty, holding Marcus's gaze with an intensity that made him feel exposed and treasured at the same time. "Luna," Marcus began, but she held up a hand to stop him. "Let me finish," she signed. 3 weeks ago, I was property. Something to be bought and sold and used. But you made me a partner. You taught me I could be more than what men decided to do with me." Marcus felt his throat tighten with emotions he had no words for. "That's not enough reason to stay. Bound by illegal papers." "Then I'll tear up the papers," Luna signed with fierce determination. "I'll stay because I want to stay. Because this is the first place I've ever felt home." Before Marcus could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention. A fourth rider was approaching fast, a man Marcus recognized with a sinking heart. Buck Henley rode like the devil was chasing him, his face red with exertion and fury. Well, Buck called out as he reined in his lathered horse. "Looks like the hermit's little acquisition has drawn some federal attention." Marshal Davis stepped forward, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. "Mr. Henley, I presume? We understand you also bid on Miss Littlefeather's contract." Buck's eyes glittered with malicious satisfaction. "Sure did. Would have treated her real good, too. If Holloway here hadn't outbid me." His gaze shifted to Luna, traveling over her body in a way that made Marcus's hands clench into fists. "Course, if the contract's no good, maybe there's still time to work out a different arrangement." "There will be no arrangements," Luna said, her voice carrying a strength that surprised everyone present. "I am not for sale anymore." Buck laughed, a harsh sound that carried no humor. "Little Cherokee girl thinks she's got choices now, does she? You're still on the frontier, sweetheart. Out here, women, especially Indian women, don't get to choose much of anything." The threat in his words was unmistakable, and Marcus felt something dangerous stir in his chest. He stepped in front of Luna, his massive frame blocking Buck's view of her. "You'd best ride on, Buck," Marcus said, his voice low and steady. "Nothing here concerns you anymore." "Oh, but it does," Buck replied, his hand drifting toward his pistol. "See, I've been thinking about that pretty little thing for weeks now. Wondering what she'd look like without all those clothes. Wondering what sounds she'd make if a real man showed her what she was good for." Marshal Davis's gun was out of its holster before Buck finished speaking. "That's enough. You'll keep your thoughts to yourself and your hands where I can see them." But Buck was beyond reason now, fueled by weeks of frustrated desire and the kind of entitlement that came from never being denied anything he wanted. "You federal boys don't understand how things work out here. That girl's going to need protecting. And I'm willing to provide it. For a fair price, of course." Luna stepped out from behind Marcus, her chin raised in that gesture of defiance he'd come to love. When she spoke, her words were clear and carrying, meant for everyone to hear. "My grandmother once told me that some men mistake silence for weakness," she said, her accent lending dignity to every syllable. "But I am not weak, and I am not silent by choice. I am Cherokee. My people survived the Trail of Tears, the land grabbers, the Indian Wars. We survived by being stronger than the men who tried to break us." She paused, her dark eyes fixed on Buck's face with unwavering intensity. "You think because I cannot hear your threats, I cannot defend myself. You are wrong." To everyone's surprise, Luna reached into the folds of her dress and withdrew a knife, not a kitchen blade, but a true Cherokee hunting knife with a bone handle carved with traditional symbols. She held it with the easy familiarity of someone who had been trained in its use from childhood. "My father may have gambled away my freedom," Luna continued, "but he never took away my strength. And this man," she gestured toward Marcus, "gave me back my choice. I choose to stay. I choose to fight for that choice. And I choose to cut any man who tries to take it from me." The knife caught the afternoon sunlight, its steel edge gleaming with promise. Buck's hand froze halfway to his gun, suddenly aware that the situation had shifted beyond his control. Marshal Davis stepped forward, his own weapon still drawn. "Mr. Henley, I strongly suggest you reconsider your approach. Threatening a federal witness is a serious crime." "Witness?" Buck's voice cracked slightly. "Miss Littlefeather's testimony will be crucial in our investigation of illegal indenture contracts," the marshal explained smoothly. "Any attempt to intimidate or harm her would be viewed as obstruction of federal justice." For a moment, the tableau held 5 people balanced on the knife's edge of violence, waiting to see who would break first. Then Buck's bravado crumbled like wet paper. He was a bully and a predator, but he wasn't stupid enough to draw on a federal marshal. "This ain't over," Buck muttered, wheeling his horse around. "Cherokee girl or not, she's still just an Indian in white man's country. Won't always have protection." As Buck rode away, his threats trailing behind him like smoke, Marshal Davis holstered his weapon and turned to Luna with new respect in his eyes. "That was bravely done, Miss Littlefeather. But he's not entirely wrong about the dangers you might face. Are you certain you want to remain here, isolated from your own people?" Luna looked at Marcus, then at the ranch spread out around them, the mountains that had witnessed their growing partnership, the barn where they'd learned to speak each other's languages, the land where they'd worked side by side to save a trapped animal. When she spoke, her voice was soft but certain. "Sometimes home is not where you come from," she said. "Sometimes it is where you choose to grow." Marshal Davis nodded slowly. "Very well. We'll need to conduct a formal interview for our investigation. But based on what I've observed today, it seems clear that Miss Littlefeather is here by her own choice." He looked at Marcus. "Mr. Holloway, I trust you understand the responsibility that comes with that choice." Marcus met the marshal's gaze. "Steadily, I understand." "Then we'll be on our way," Marshal Davis said, mounting his horse. "Miss Littlefeather, if you ever change your mind, The Cherokee Nation office in Tahlequah will help you reconnect with your people. As the federal agents rode away with Sheriff Bradley, Marcus and Luna stood together in the deepening afternoon. Shadows. The silence between them was different, now not the careful quiet of strangers learning to trust, but the comfortable peace of two people who had made their choice and were prepared to defend it. "Are you sure?" Marcus signed, giving her one last chance to reconsider. You could have freedom. A chance to start over somewhere safe. Luna smiled, the expression transforming her face from merely beautiful to radiant. "I told you," she signed. Back, her movements graceful and certain. "I am starting over. Here, with you." That evening, they sat together by the fire in the main house for the first time since Luna's arrival. Marcus had built up the flames until they roared in the stone hearth, driving away the cold that seemed to have settled into his bones during the confrontation with the marshals. Luna sat beside him on the worn leather sofa, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her presence. "Tell me about your grandmother," Marcus said aloud, knowing Luna could read his lips in the firelight. "The one who taught you about animals and strength." Luna's hands moved in gentle, graceful signs as she painted pictures of a Cherokee matriarch who had lived through the worst of times but never lost her dignity or her wisdom. A woman who had taught her granddaughter that survival wasn't just about staying alive, it was about maintaining your spirit, your culture, your sense of self in the face of forces that wanted to strip all of those things away. As Luna's story unfolded, Marcus found himself thinking about Sarah, about the different ways people could be strong. Sarah's strength had been like sunlight, warm and nurturing, helping everything around her grow and flourish. Luna's strength was more like mountain stone tested by weather and time, shaped by hardship into something unbreakable. "She sounds like she was remarkable," Marcus said when Luna finished her story. "She was," Luna replied, speaking aloud rather than signing. "But I think she would have liked you." "Why?" Luna considered the question seriously. "Because you see people for who they choose to be, not for what others decide they are worth." Outside, snow began to fall again, but neither of them minded. They had made their choice, declared it in front of federal marshals and local threats alike. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight they were home. The weeks following the marshal's visit brought an unexpected peace to the Holloway Ranch. Spring was fighting its way through winter's stubborn grip, and with it came changes that neither Marcus nor Luna had anticipated. The ice on the creek began to crack and sing, creating music that Luna could feel through the soles of her feet when she walked along its banks. Green shoots pushed through the snow in sheltered spots, and the days grew noticeably longer. Luna had moved into the main house, taking the small room upstairs that had once been intended as a nursery. Marcus had cleaned it out with careful reverence. Folding away the tiny clothes Sarah had sewn with such hope, and storing them in the cedar chest at the foot of his bed. The room felt different with Luna's presence, lighter, somehow, as if her quiet strength had chased away the ghosts that had lingered there. Their morning routine had evolved into something that felt startlingly domestic. Luna would rise before dawn to tend the animals, her movements sure and efficient in the pre-dawn darkness. By the time Marcus came downstairs, she would have coffee brewing and breakfast started, working by the light of the oil lamp with the focused intensity that characterized everything she did. This particular morning, Marcus found her standing at the kitchen window, her hands pressed flat against the glass. The expression on her face was one he'd never seen before, a mixture of wonder and something that looked almost like fear. "What is it?" Marcus asked, moving to stand beside her. Luna pointed outside, and Marcus followed her gaze to see what had captured her attention so completely. There, in the pasture beyond the barn, stood a magnificent elk, a massive bull with antlers that seemed to span half the sky. The animal was grazing peacefully among Marcus's cattle, completely at ease, despite being surrounded by domestic animals. "He's beautiful," Luna breathed, her voice soft with awe. "But why isn't he afraid?" Marcus studied the elk, noting the way. It moved with deliberate grace, never rushing, never showing any sign of panic despite being in close proximity to the ranch buildings. Maybe he's not afraid because he knows he's safe here. Luna turned to look at Marcus, her dark eyes searching. His face. Is that why you're not afraid anymore? The question caught Marcus off guard. What makes you think I'm not afraid? You smile now, Luna said simply. Real smiles, not the polite ones you give to strangers. And you sleep through the night instead of pacing the floors like you did when I first arrived. Marcus hadn't realized. She'd been aware of his nighttime restlessness during those early weeks. But then again, Luna noticed everything, every change in expression, every shift in posture, every unguarded moment when his carefully maintained composure slipped. I sleep better because I'm not alone anymore, Marcus admitted. For 3 years, I went to bed every night wondering if I'd wake up to find another reason to keep going. Now I wake up knowing I have work to do, someone to care for. He'd almost said someone to love, but that truth was still too new, too fragile to speak aloud. Luna seemed to understand anyway. Her hand found his on the windowsill, her fingers warm and steady against his skin. I used to dream about running away, Luna said, her eyes fixed on the elk outside. Every night I would plan different escape routes, different places I could go where no one would find me. But I haven't had those dreams since I came here. What do you dream about now? Marcus asked. Luna's cheeks flushed pink, and she looked down at their joined hands. I dream about gardens, about planting seeds and watching them grow, about... She paused, seeming to struggle with words. About having a place that's really mine. Not just somewhere I'm allowed to stay, but somewhere I belong. Marcus turned his hand palm up, threading their fingers together. Luna, I need you to know something. The indenture papers, I burned them last week. Luna's eyes flew to his face, wide with shock. You what? I burned them, Marcus repeated. You were right when you said you'd tear them up. They never should have existed in the first place. You're not my property, Luna. You're not my responsibility or my debt to settle. You're... He struggled to find words that would encompass everything she'd become to him: partner, friend, the light that had somehow found its way into the darkness of his grief and shown him that it was possible to live again instead of merely surviving. You're my choice, he said finally. Just like I hope I'm yours. Luna's smile was radiant, transforming her entire face. You are, she whispered. You absolutely are. The moment was interrupted by a sharp rap on the front door. Marcus and Luna exchanged glances. Visitors were rare at the ranch, and after the recent confrontation with Buck Henley and the federal marshals, unexpected guests felt ominous. Marcus opened the door to find Father Miguel Santos, the traveling priest who made circuits through the Montana Territory. The elderly man was small and weathered, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles and hands that spoke of a lifetime of hard work before he'd found his calling. Mr. Holloway, Father Santos said, removing his hat. I hope I'm not intruding. I was in the area and thought I'd stop by to see how you were faring. Marcus had known Father Santos for years. The priest had officiated at Sarah's funeral and had made several attempts to offer spiritual comfort during the darkest period of Marcus's grief. But Marcus had turned away from faith when God seemed to turn away from him, and their relationship had grown distant. Father, Marcus said, stepping aside to let the older man enter. You're always welcome here. Luna appeared in the doorway to the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. She'd been kneading bread dough, and flour streaked her dark hair like snow. When she saw the priest, her posture grew cautious, not fearful, exactly, but wary, in the way of someone who had learned that men in positions of authority weren't always all eyes. And you must be the young lady I've been hearing about, Father Santos said, his voice gentle and respectful. I'm Father Miguel Santos. I've been ministering to the people of this territory for nearly 20 years. Luna inclined her head politely. I am Luna Littlefeather." If Father Santos was surprised by her clear speech or her direct gaze, he didn't show it. Instead, he smiled with genuine warmth. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Miss Littlefeather. I hope you've found peace here in our mountains." "I have," Luna replied simply. Father Santos accepted Marcus's offer of coffee and settled into one of the kitchen chairs, with the air of a man who had learned to find comfort in simple hospitality. As Luna served him, Marcus noticed how the priest watched her movements with respectful attention, never staring but clearly observing. "I understand there was some trouble with federal marshals recently," Father Santos said, warming his hands around his coffee cup. "I hope everything was resolved satisfactorily." "It was," Marcus replied. "Luna's free to make her own choices about where she wants to live and with whom." "I'm glad to hear it," the priest said. "The Lord works in mysterious ways, but he rarely approves of one person owning another." He looked at Luna with gentle curiosity. "Were you raised in the Christian faith, my dear?" Luna's expression grew thoughtful. "My grandmother was traditional Cherokee, but she also respected the Jesus teachings. She said there was room in the world for many kinds of truth." "A wise woman," Father Santos said approvingly. "I've found that faith is less about the specific words we use and more about the love we carry in our hearts." As the conversation continued, Marcus found himself watching Luna with new eyes. She responded to Father Santos with intelligence and dignity, holding her own in discussions of faith, philosophy, and the practical challenges of frontier life. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was thriving, growing into the fullness of who she was meant to be. "Marcus," Father Santos said eventually, "might I speak with you privately for a moment?" They stepped out onto the front porch, leaving Luna to her bread-making. The elk was still visible in the pasture, now lying in a sunny spot with Marcus's cattle gathered around him like courtiers attending a king. "She's remarkable," Father Santos said without preamble. "Intelligent, strong, spiritually centered. And she clearly cares for you a great deal." Marcus felt heat rise in his cheeks. "Father, I'm not here to judge my son," the priest interrupted gently. "I'm here because I can see something I haven't seen in your face for 3 years. Peace. Luna has brought you back to the land of the living." Marcus looked out at his ranch, the buildings he'd maintained through sheer stubbornness, the land that had witnessed his grief and his gradual healing. "I thought I was saving her when I bought her contract," he said quietly. "Turns out she was saving me." "The best relationships often work that way," Father Santos observed. "Two people discovering they're stronger together than either could be alone." He paused, studying Marcus's face. "Have you talked about the future? About making your arrangement official?" The question hit Marcus like cold water. Marriage. The word carried so much weight, promises and obligations, joy and terror in equal measure. He'd been married before, had experienced the profound happiness of finding his other half, and the devastating pain of losing her. The thought of opening himself to that kind of vulnerability again was both thrilling and terrifying. "It's complicated," Marcus said finally. "Love always is," Father Santos replied with a smile, "but that doesn't make it wrong." That evening, as they sat together by the fire, Marcus found himself studying Luna's face in the flickering light. She was working on a new embroidery project, table runner decorated with traditional Cherokee patterns, worked in threads she'd carefully pulled from old fabric. Her concentration was complete, her needle moving with the precision of someone who had learned to create beauty even in the midst of hardship. "Luna," Marcus said, waiting until she looked up at him. "Father Santos asked me about our future today." Luna set down her needlework, giving him her full attention. "What did you tell him?" "That it was complicated," Marcus admitted. "But I've been thinking about it all day, and maybe it doesn't have to be." Luna tilted her head in that characteristic gesture, waiting for him to continue. Marcus took a deep breath, knowing that what he said next would change everything between them. I love you, Luna. Not as someone I'm protecting or caring for out of duty, but as a woman I choose to build a life with. If you'll have me." The words hung in the air between them, carrying all the weight of hope and fear that came with declarations of love. Luna's eyes filled with tears, but her smile was radiant. "I love you too, Marcus Holloway," she said, her voice strong and sure. "And yes, I'll have you. I'll have this life we're building together." Outside, the elk bugled a sound that carried across the mountains like a song of triumph. Inside, by the warmth of the fire, two people who had found their way to each other despite impossible odds began planning a future neither had dared to dream of just months before. Love, as Father Santos had observed, was indeed complicated. But sometimes, in the quiet moments between one heartbeat and the next, it was also beautifully simple. The wedding preparations began the following week with all the quiet intensity that characterized everything Luna did. She had accepted Marcus's proposal with a joy that seemed to illuminate her from within. But as the reality of their impending marriage settled in, both of them discovered that declaring love was only the beginning of building a life together. Luna threw herself into the preparations with the same focused energy she brought to everything else. She spent hours at the kitchen table, carefully planning a ceremony that would honor both her Cherokee heritage and Marcus's desire for something that felt legitimate in the eyes of their community. Father Santos had agreed to perform the ceremony, but Luna wanted to include traditional Cherokee elements, something that required delicate negotiation in a territory where native customs were often viewed with suspicion. Marcus watched her work with growing admiration and a touch of concern. Luna approached their wedding like a military campaign, considering every detail, anticipating every possible complication. She'd made lists of supplies needed, sketched out arrangements for the ceremony site, and even started teaching Marcus basic Cherokee phrases so he could participate meaningfully in the traditional portions of the ritual. "You don't have to make it perfect," Marcus said one evening, finding her hunched over fabric samples by lamplight. She was hand-sewing her wedding dress, a simple but elegant design that incorporated both white cotton and traditional Cherokee ribbon work in deep blues and silvers. Luna looked up, needle paused mid-stitch. "I want it to mean something," she sighed, her free hand moving gracefully through the familiar gestures. "Not just legal words, but something that shows we're choosing each other completely." Marcus understood her intensity, though it worried him. Luna had spent so much of her life having choices taken away from her that now, faced with the most important choice she'd ever made, she was determined to control every aspect of it. But life, as Marcus had learned through bitter experience, rarely allowed such control. The first sign of trouble came on a Tuesday morning in late April. Marcus was repairing fence posts in the south pasture when he spotted smoke rising from the direction of town. Too much smoke, too dark to be anything good. By the time he rode close enough to investigate, half of Copper Falls's main street was ablaze. The fire had started at McKinnon's trading post, though by the time Marcus arrived, the building was too far gone to save. The townspeople had formed bucket brigades, working frantically to keep the flames from spreading to the other wooden structures that lined the street. Marcus threw himself into the effort, hauling water and helping to organize evacuation of the most threatened buildings. It wasn't until the fire was finally under control, hours later, that Marcus learned the cause. Jeremiah McKinnon stood in the smoldering ruins of his business, his ferret-like face streaked with soot and twisted with rage. "It was that Cherokee witch," McKinnon snarled to anyone who would listen. "She cursed my place. Mark my words. Been nothing but trouble since I sold her to Holloway." Sheriff Bradley looked skeptical. "Jeremiah, we found lamp oil splashed all over the back room. This fire didn't start by accident, but it wasn't any kind of curse either." But McKinnon wasn't interested in logic. He'd lost everything, his business, his inventory, and worst of all, his sense of control over his small corner of the world. In his mind, it was easier to blame Luna, than to accept that his careless handling of flammable materials had destroyed his livelihood. "She's been practicing witchcraft up at that ranch," McKinnon continued, his voice rising to carry across the crowd of exhausted firefighters. "Indian magic, cursing decent Christian folk. Mark my words, there'll be more trouble as long as she's in this territory." Marcus stepped forward, his massive frame casting a long shadow across the ruined storefront. "That's enough, McKinnon. Luna's never done anything but mind her own business and help where she's needed." "Help?" McKinnon laughed bitterly. "She helped herself to your money, didn't she? Got you so bewitched you can't see straight. What kind of Christian man takes an Indian woman to wife when there's decent white girls going without husbands?" The crowd had gone quiet, sensing the dangerous tension building between the two men. Marcus felt something cold and violent stir in his chest, the same protective fury that had driven him to buy Luna's contract in the first place. "You'll keep Luna's name out of your mouth," Marcus said, his voice low but carrying clearly in the sudden stillness. "And if I hear you spreading lies about her, we'll have a different kind of conversation." McKinnon's eyes glittered with malicious satisfaction. He'd found Marcus's weakness, and he intended to press it. "Truth isn't lies, Holloway. That girl's got you under some kind of spell, and decent folks are starting to take notice." Before Marcus could respond, Buck Henley emerged from the crowd of onlookers. His clothes were clean, notably free of the soot and grime that marked everyone who'd helped fight the fire. His presence here, Marcus realized, hadn't been to help. It had been to watch and perhaps to fan the flames of suspicion that McKinnon was trying to kindle. "McKinnon's right," Buck announced, his voice pitched to carry to the edges of the crowd. "Strange how trouble seems to follow that Cherokee girl wherever she goes. First her daddy dies of mysterious circumstances, then she ends up owned by the only man in town fool enough to pay premium price for damaged goods." Marcus's hands clenched into fists, but before he could move, Sheriff Bradley stepped between them. "That's enough from both of you. This fire was an accident, plain and simple. Nobody's cursing anybody, and I don't want to hear any more talk about it. But the damage was done." Marcus could see it in the faces around him, the subtle shift from sympathy to suspicion, the way conversations died when he approached, the sideways glances that followed him as he made his way back to his horse. McKinnon and Buck had planted seeds of doubt about Luna, and in a community already uneasy about the federal investigation into illegal indenture contracts, those seeds would find fertile ground. Marcus rode home through the gathering dusk with a heavy heart, dreading the conversation he'd have to have with Luna. She was waiting on the front porch when he arrived, her face tight with worry. "I saw the smoke," she said as he dismounted. "Is everyone safe?" Marcus nodded, pulling her into his arms and holding her close. For a moment, they stood together in the fading light, drawing strength from each other's presence. Then Marcus told her everything, McKinnon's accusations, Buck's insinuations, the shift in the town's mood that he'd felt like a physical thing. Luna listened without interruption, her expression growing more troubled with each detail. When Marcus finished, she was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the mountains that had become her refuge. "They're afraid," she said finally. "Not of me specifically, but of what I represent. Change. The idea that their world isn't as fixed and controllable as they thought." Marcus was continually amazed by Luna's ability to see beyond her own pain to the larger truths that drove human behavior. "Does that make it easier to bear?" Luna shook her head. "Understanding doesn't make it hurt less, but it helps me know what we're really fighting." Over the next few days, the consequences of the town's shifting mood became clear. The merchant who'd promised to order special fabric for Luna's wedding dress suddenly found excuses for why the order couldn't be filled. The blacksmith who'd agreed to make new horseshoes for Marcus's horses was too busy to take on the work. Even Father Santos, when he stopped by to discuss wedding arrangements, seemed more subdued than usual. There's talk in town, the priest admitted reluctantly. Foolish talk, based on fear and ignorance, but talk nonetheless. What kind of talk? Luna asked, though Marcus could tell from her expression that she already suspected. Some folks are saying it's not proper for a white man to marry an Indian woman, Father Santos said carefully. Others are concerned about the irregularities surrounding how you came to be here. Marcus felt anger flare in his chest. There's nothing irregular about two people choosing to build a life together. I agree completely, Father Santos said quickly. But perception can be as powerful as reality, especially in a small community where everyone knows everyone else's business. Luna was quiet through this exchange, her hands folded in her lap and her expression unreadable. Finally, she looked up at Father Santos with those direct, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. Are you saying you won't perform the ceremony? She asked. Not at all, the priest replied firmly. I'll marry you tomorrow if that's what you want. But I think you should be prepared for the fact that not everyone will accept your union, no matter how legal it might be. That night, as they lay in their separate rooms, Marcus still insisted on maintaining propriety until they were officially married. Both of them stared at their ceilings and wondered what they were walking into. The love between them was real, powerful, transformative. But love, as they were learning, didn't exist in a vacuum. It had to survive in the world, surrounded by people who might not understand it or want it to succeed. The crisis came 3 days later. Marcus was working in the barn when Luna came running from the house, her face pale with fear. In her hands was a piece of paper, a note that someone had nailed to their front door while they were busy with morning chores. Marcus read the message with growing fury. The Cherokee witch and her fool are not welcome in decent society. Cancel the wedding or face the consequences. Some traditions are worth preserving. There was no signature, but the message was clear enough. Someone, possibly several someones, was prepared to take action to prevent their marriage from taking place. Marcus looked at her, this brave, intelligent, beautiful woman who had already endured more than her share of running and hiding and starting over. She was offering to give up the first real home she'd ever known, the first place she'd ever felt truly safe, because other people couldn't accept their love. No, Marcus said firmly. We're not running. This is our home, Luna. We've built something here together, something real and good. I'll be damned if I let fear and ignorance drive us away from it. Luna's smile was tremulous but genuine. Then we fight, Marcus confirmed. But we do it together. Whatever comes, we face it as partners. Outside, storm clouds were gathering over the mountains, promising the kind of spring tempest that could reshape the landscape in a matter of hours. Inside, two people who had found love against impossible odds, prepared to defend it against forces that would tear them apart. The wedding was still 3 days away. But the real test of their commitment to each other was about to begin. The morning of the wedding dawned with a clarity that seemed almost supernatural, as if the Montana sky itself had been scrubbed clean to witness what was about to unfold. The air carried the crisp bite of mountain spring, sharp with the scent of pine and snowmelt, while golden sunlight painted the peaks in shades that had no earthly names. Luna rose before sunrise, as had become her habit, but today felt different from all the mornings that had come before. Today, she would speak vows that would transform her from Luna Littlefeather, the orphaned Cherokee girl sold for horse feed, into Luna Holloway, the chosen wife of a man who had seen her worth when the rest of the world saw only property. She dressed with ceremonial care, beginning with the traditional Cherokee wedding dress she had sewn by hand over the past weeks. The garment was a masterpiece of cultural fusion white cotton in the style expected by the white community, but decorated with intricate beadwork and ribbon patterns that told the story of her ancestry in symbols older than written words. The blues and silvers caught the morning light like captured pieces of sky and water, while tiny bells sewn into the hem sang softly with each movement. As she braided her long black hair with ribbons of sacred colors, Luna thought about all the Cherokee women who had performed this same ritual before her grandmothers and great-grandmothers, who had prepared themselves for marriage in circumstances far different from hers, but with the same hopes for love and partnership that filled her heart today. Marcus had left the house before dawn, understanding instinctively that Luna needed this time alone to prepare not just her body, but her spirit for what lay ahead. He'd gone to the site they'd chosen for the ceremony, a meadow on his property, where wildflowers bloomed in defiant splashes of color against the lingering patches of snow. There, he worked alongside Father Santos to construct a simple altar from stones gathered from the creek bed, each one chosen for its smooth perfection and arranged according to both Christian tradition and Cherokee custom. The altar itself was a work of art, 7 stones representing the 7 Cherokee clans, arranged in a sacred circle with white sage burning at its center. Father Santos had contributed a simple wooden cross, hand-carved from pine that had grown on this very land, while Marcus added wildflowers picked at dawn when the dew still held the night's dreams. As the sun climbed higher, guests began to arrive, though not the crowd they had originally envisioned. Marshal Davis had returned from his territorial circuit specifically to attend, bringing with him 2 Cherokee representatives from the Federal Indian Agency who had traveled hundreds of miles to witness this historic union. Sheriff Bradley came too, his presence serving as both support and subtle security against any trouble that might arise. Dr. Harrison arrived early, his medical bag in tow, despite this being a social occasion, a habit born from decades of frontier life where emergencies could arise at any moment. The town schoolteacher, Miss Emily Patterson, came bearing a handwritten copy of Longfellow's latest poem as a wedding gift, her presence representing the small but growing number of educated women who believed in Luna's right to choose her own destiny. But it was the absence of guests that spoke most loudly about the challenges they faced. The merchants who had initially promised to attend sent polite regrets, accompanied by hastily purchased gifts that felt more like guilt offerings than celebrations. Neighboring ranchers discovered sudden emergencies that prevented their participation. Even some of Marcus's oldest acquaintances found reasons to stay away, unwilling to be seen endorsing a marriage that challenged every social convention their community held sacred. Luna felt their absence like physical blows, each missing face a reminder that acceptance would not come easily in their new life together. But as she made her final preparations, she also felt something stronger than disappointment: determination. She had survived being sold like livestock, had endured months of uncertainty and fear, had fought off men who saw her as nothing more than an object for their use. She would not be defeated now by the small-minded prejudices of people too frightened to see beyond the color of her skin. Soft knock at her bedroom door interrupted her thoughts. When she opened it, she found an unexpected visitor, Mrs. Catherine Walsh, the elderly widow who ran the town's only dress shop. The woman's face was stern, her gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, but her eyes held something Luna hadn't expected to see: respect, and perhaps even a touch of admiration. "Miss Littlefeather," Mrs. Walsh said formally, though her voice carried warmth beneath its proper exterior. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion, but I have something for you." She held out a small wooden box, carved with delicate roses and polished, to a warm gleam that spoke of decades of careful tending. When Luna opened it, she gasped. Inside, nestled in faded silk that had once been ivory but now held the soft yellow tint of age, was the most beautiful piece of jewelry she had ever seen, a necklace of silver and turquoise that seemed to capture the essence of both mountain sky and flowing water. The silver work was exquisite, wrought by hands that understood the spiritual significance of each twist and curve. The turquoise stones were of the finest quality, their blue-green depths holding flecks of gold that caught light like captured sunbeams. But it was more than just beautiful, it was sacred, Luna realized. This was ceremonial jewelry, the kind passed down through generations of women who understood that some things transcended mere decoration. It was my grandmother's, Mrs. Walsh explained, her voice carefully neutral but her eyes betraying deeper emotion. She was half Cheyenne, though we never talked about it much in polite society. My grandfather bought her from a trader when she was about your age, different times, different circumstances, but love found a way. Luna felt tears prick her eyes as she lifted the necklace from its resting place. The silver was warm to the touch, as if it held some essence of all the women who had worn it before. Each stone seemed to pulse with its own inner light, and Luna could almost hear the whispered prayers and blessings that had been spoken over this precious heirloom. Mrs. Walsh, I can't accept something so precious. Luna began, but the older woman held up a weathered hand to stop her protests. You can and you will, Mrs. Walsh said firmly, her stern demeanor cracking to reveal the kind heart beneath. My grandmother would have wanted it worn by someone who understood what it meant to be strong in a world that didn't always appreciate strength in women. Someone who knew the weight of choosing love over convention, of building bridges instead of walls. She paused, studying Luna's face with shrewd eyes that had seen decades of human nature in all its complexity. Besides, that boy of yours looks at you like you hung the moon and stars. Any fool can see you love each other. That's more than most couples can claim, regardless of what color they happen to be. As Mrs. Walsh fastened the necklace around Luna's throat with gentle, practiced fingers, Luna felt a connection not just to this one kind woman, but to a chain of strong women stretching back through generations, Cherokee grandmothers who had survived removal and war, pioneer women who had carved homes from wilderness, mixed-blood daughters who had navigated between two worlds with grace and courage, all the countless females who had loved and fought, and endured so that this moment could exist. The weight of the necklace against her collarbone felt like a blessing, a tangible reminder that she was not alone in her journey. She was part of something larger, something that transcended the petty prejudices of those who would judge her by the color of her skin rather than the content of her character. Meanwhile, Marcus was discovering that his own preparations were being complicated by an unexpected and unwelcome development. Buck Henley had arrived at the ceremony site with half a dozen men, all of them armed and wearing expressions that suggested they hadn't come to offer congratulations or throw rice. The men spread out across the meadow with military precision, their hands resting on gun belts and their eyes scanning the area like predators evaluating territory. Buck himself stood at their center, his chest puffed out with the kind of false bravado that came from having followers to impress. "Holloway," Buck called out as Marcus continued arranging wildflowers on the stone altar, his voice carrying the false heartiness of a man trying to sound reasonable while making threats. "We need to talk." Marcus straightened slowly, his massive frame casting a long shadow across the meadow. At 7 feet tall and built like a mountain, he made an intimidating figure even when he wasn't angry. But there was something in his storm-gray eyes today that promised violence to anyone who threatened what he held dear. "Unless you're here to wish Luna and me well, we have nothing to discuss," Marcus replied, his voice carrying the kind of deadly calm that experienced men learn to fear. "That's where you're wrong, big man," Buck replied, his hand resting casually on his gun belt in a gesture meant to be both threatening and casual. "See, we've been talking in town decent folks, Christian folks, and we've come to the conclusion that this wedding can't be allowed to happen." Father Santos stepped forward, his elderly frame small but dignified in the face of Buck's implied threats. Despite his advanced years and peaceful calling, there was steel in the old priest's spine that had been forged in the early days of frontier ministry, when men of God had to be ready to defend their flocks with more than just prayers. "Mr. Henley," Father Santos said with quiet authority, "this is a legal ceremony between two consenting adults who have met all the requirements of both civil and canon law. You have no authority, legal, moral, or otherwise, to prevent it." Buck's laugh was harsh and ugly, the sound of a man who had convinced himself that might made right and that his desires trumped everyone else's rights. Legal don't always mean right, Padre, and right now. The right thing is to stop this abomination before it goes any further and corrupts our whole community. The word abomination hung in the spring air like a physical thing, poisoning the beauty of the morning with its venom. Marcus felt something cold and dangerous stir in his chest, the same protective fury that had driven him to buy Luna's contract in the first place, but magnified 100-fold by the love that had grown between them. Abomination? Marcus's voice was deadly quiet, the kind of calm that preceded the most dangerous storms. You're talking about the woman I love, Buck, the woman who's shown me more kindness and understanding in 6 months than I received from anyone else in 3 years of grief. Choose your next words very carefully. I'm talking about preserving the natural order, Buck shot back, his voice rising with the fervor of a man who had convinced himself he was fighting for righteousness. White women going without husbands while you take up with some Indian squaw. It ain't natural, and it ain't right. There's a proper way things are supposed to work, and this ain't it. The tension in the meadow was thick enough to cut with a knife, crackling like the air before a lightning strike. Marshall Davis, who had been quietly observing from the edges of the gathering while making mental notes about which men might need watching in the future, stepped forward with his hand on his weapon and his badge catching the morning sunlight. Mr. Henley, the marshal said with the quiet authority that came from years of enforcing federal law on the frontier, you and your friends are disrupting a federal witness's wedding ceremony. Miss Littlefeather's testimony has been crucial in our investigation of illegal indenture contracts, and any attempt to intimidate or harm her will be viewed as obstruction of federal justice. I strongly suggest you reconsider your position. But Buck was beyond reason now, driven by months of frustrated desire, wounded pride, and the kind of hatred that came from watching someone else find happiness that he believed should have been his. His eyes glittered with the dangerous light of a man who had convinced himself that violence was justified by his righteous cause. Federal witness or not, she's still just an Indian girl who got above her station. He snarled, spittle flying from his lips. Time someone reminded her where she belongs on her back, serving the needs of white men who know how to handle her properly. The crude threat sent a wave of anger through the assembled guests, but before anyone could respond, a clear, strong voice cut through the tension like a blade through silk. And where exactly do I belong, Mr. Henley? Every head turned toward the edge of the meadow, where Luna had appeared like a vision from another world. She moved with the fluid grace of flowing water, her wedding dress catching the sunlight and throwing it back in patterns that seemed almost magical. The Cherokee necklace gleamed at her throat, and her head was held high with the kind of dignity that couldn't be learned, only inherited from generations of women who had faced down worse men than Buck Henley and emerged victorious. But it wasn't just her appearance that struck the gathered men speechless. It was her presence, the quiet strength that radiated from every gesture, the unmistakable aura of a woman who had found her place in the world and would not be moved from it by threats or intimidation. As she walked across the meadow toward the altar, Luna began to sing not the tentative humming they'd grown accustomed to, but a full-throated Cherokee wedding song that seemed to make the very air shimmer with beauty and power. Her voice rose and fell in ancient patterns, telling the story of creation, of the first man and woman who chose each other and built a world together, through love and mutual respect. Buck's face twisted with ugly emotions as he watched Luna approach the altar, his desire and hatred warring with a grudging recognition of her undeniable beauty and dignity. Well, if it isn't the Cherokee princess herself, he said, his voice dripping with false courtesy that fooled no one. Come to bewitch another poor fool, have you? Luna stopped singing and looked directly at Buck, her dark eyes steady and unafraid. When she spoke, her voice carried clearly across the meadow, each word precisely articulated and ringing with conviction, that came from deep wells of inner strength. "I know what you think I am," she said, addressing not just Buck but everyone, present supporters and detractors alike. "You see my skin, my heritage, and you think you know my story. Poor Indian girl, sold into slavery, rescued by the pity of a white man who couldn't find himself a proper white wife." She paused, letting her words settle in the spring air like seeds that would either take root or blow away, depending on the soil of each listener's heart. "But that is not my story. That is the story you tell yourselves to make sense of something that challenges everything you believe about how the world should work." Her eyes found Marcus across the meadow, and her smile was radiant with love. "Certainty. My real story is about choice. About finding someone who sees me not as property, or as a burden, or as some exotic prize to be conquered, but as a partner. Someone who learned my language not because he had to, but because he wanted. To understand the deepest parts of who I am. Someone who gave me freedom, and then hope not demanded, but hope that I would choose to stay." She turned to face Buck directly, her chin raised in that gesture of defiance that Marcus had come to love so deeply. "My story is about a Cherokee woman who chose her own fate and a mountain man who was brave enough to choose her back, knowing it would cost him the approval of small minds and weak hearts." The power of her words seemed to transform the very air around them, turning what had been a confrontation into something approaching a sacred moment. Even some of Buck's men were shifting uncomfortably, their certainty shaken by the dignity and strength of this young woman who refused to be diminished by their prejudice. "You think you can stop this wedding with threats and hatred," Luna continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "You think fear is more powerful than love, that prejudice can overcome truth, that violence can silence the voice of justice. But you are wrong, Mr. Henley. Love is stronger than fear. Truth is more enduring than lies. And today, in this place, love wins." As if summoned by her words, more guests began arriving, people Marcus hadn't expected to see. Folks who had made the difficult choice to stand with love against hatred. Mrs. Walsh came first, her stern face softened by something that might have been pride as she saw her grandmother's necklace gleaming at Luna's throat. Behind her came Dr. Harrison, the town's physician, who had treated Luna for a minor injury the month before and had been impressed, not just by her knowledge of herbal medicine, but by her grace under pressure. The postmaster arrived with his wife and 3 children, the youngest of whom had learned sign language from Luna and was now eagerly signing "beautiful bride" in her direction. Several of the women who had worked alongside Luna during a recent church fundraiser came in a group, their presence representing a quiet revolution in the social fabric of their community. But the most surprising and moving arrival was a group of Cherokee from the reservation, led by an elderly man whose presence commanded immediate respect from everyone present, regardless of their cultural background. Luna's breath caught in her throat as she recognized him. Joseph Ridge, a respected elder who had known her grandmother and who represented the traditional Cherokee Council in negotiations with the federal government. "Little Moon," the old man said in Cherokee, using Luna's childhood name and speaking loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Your grandmother's spirit sings with joy today. She told me this day would come when her granddaughter would build a bridge between worlds and show that love knows no boundaries." The ceremony that followed was unlike anything the Montana Territory had ever witnessed. Father Santos spoke the traditional Christian vows in English, while Elder Ridge offered Cherokee blessings in his native tongue, creating a bridge between 2 cultures that honored both without diminishing either. Luna and Marcus exchanged rings, simple silver bands that Marcus had hammered from ore he'd mined himself, each one inscribed with words in both English and Cherokee syllabary. When Father Santos asked if anyone present had reason why this union should not proceed, the meadow fell silent except for the whisper of wind through wildflowers. Buck opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came. The power of the moment, the dignity of the couple, and the growing crowd of supporters had drained the venom from his protests. Luna's vows were spoken in 3 languages: Cherokee for her ancestors, English for their community, and sign language for the private communication she shared with Marcus alone. She promised to love him not just in good times, but in difficult ones, to be his partner in building something new and beautiful from the rough materials of their frontier life. Marcus's vows were simpler but no less profound. In his deep voice that carried across the meadow like rolling thunder, he promised to protect not just Luna's body, but her spirit, to honor her heritage while building new traditions together, to love her not despite their differences, but because of the strength those differences brought to their union. When it came time for the kiss that would seal their union, Marcus cupped Luna's face in his massive hands and spoke words that everyone present could understand, regardless of their language or heritage. "I love you, Luna Little Feather Holloway," he said, his voice carrying across the meadow like a promise written in stone. "I love your strength, your intelligence, your beautiful spirit. I love the way you make me want to be better than I am. I love the bridges you build and the walls you refuse to acknowledge. I love you not despite who you are, but because of who you are, all of who you are." Their kiss was gentle, reverent, and profound, the kind of kiss that seemed to stop time and make the very mountains hold their breath in appreciation. When they parted, there wasn't a dry eye among their supporters, and even some of Buck's men were looking uncomfortable with their mission, as if witnessing true love had reminded them of something they'd forgotten about their own humanity. Buck himself seemed to deflate as he watched the celebration that erupted around the newlyweds. Whatever power his hatred had held over him was broken by the simple, undeniable reality of 2 people who had found perfect love in an imperfect world. Without a word, he turned and walked away, his followers trailing behind him like deflated balloons. As the afternoon wore on and the celebration moved to the ranch house, the gathering revealed itself to be more diverse and joyful than anyone had dared hope. The wedding feast was a fusion of cultures that reflected the bride and groom, themselves roasted venison prepared with Cherokee seasonings alongside traditional wedding cake. Fiddle music mixed with Cherokee drumming, English toasts followed by native blessings. Luna moved through it all with grace and joy, her happiness so radiant that it seemed to transform everyone around her. Children who had never seen a Cherokee wedding dance learned the steps from Elder Ridge, while their parents shared stories and laughter with people they had never imagined calling friends. As evening settled over the mountains and the last guests prepared to depart, Elder Ridge approached Luna with a small bundle wrapped in soft deerskin and tied with sinew that had been blessed in sacred ceremonies. "From your grandmother," he said simply, placing the package in her hands with the reverence due to a sacred trust. "She asked me to save it for the day you found your true path, the day you became the bridge she always knew you would be." Inside, the wrapping was a medicine bag made from the finest beadwork Luna had ever seen, each tiny bead placed with precision and purpose to tell the story of her lineage. Along with the bag was a letter written in Cherokee syllabary on paper made from bark, the words flowing in the graceful script that had taken Luna years to master. Through tears of joy and wonder, Luna read her grandmother's final gift words of love and encouragement written years before, but somehow perfectly suited to this moment. The letter spoke of strength that came from embracing both sides of one's heritage, of the courage required to love across boundaries, and of the children who would carry both Cherokee and pioneer blood into the future, building a world where such divisions mattered less than the content of one's character. That night, as Mr. and Mrs. Marcus Holloway sat together on their front porch watching the stars emerge over their mountain home, they reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From a cruel transaction in a trading post to a wedding that had defied every convention of their time and place, it had been a path neither could have imagined when they first met across that smoky room where men bid on human lives. "Do you think it will get easier?" Luna asked, her head resting against Marcus's broad shoulder, while her fingers traced the silver work of her grandmother's necklace. "Some things will," Marcus replied thoughtfully, his arm tightening around his wife with protective tenderness. "Others might get harder. People like Buck don't change their hearts overnight, and there will always be those who see our love as a threat to their narrow view of how the world should work." He paused, looking out at the vast expanse of mountain and sky that stretched endlessly before them. "But we'll face whatever comes together as equals, as partners, as people who chose each other freely and completely. And maybe, just maybe, we'll help other people see that love doesn't diminish when it crosses boundaries, it grows stronger." Luna smiled in the darkness, thinking of all the women who had worn Mrs. Walsh's grandmother's necklace, of the Cherokee ancestors who had survived impossible hardships, of the pioneer wives who had carved lives from wilderness. She was part of that chain now, adding her own story to the long history of women who had refused to be broken by the world's cruelty. "We did it," she whispered, more to herself than to Marcus, her voice filled with wonder at the magnitude of what they had accomplished. "We did," he agreed, pressing a gentle kiss to the top of her head. "And this is just the beginning of our story." Above them, the Montana sky spread out in all its infinite glory, filled with stars that had witnessed countless love stories, but few as unlikely, or as powerful as the one being written in the valley below. A deaf Cherokee girl and a grieving giant had found their way to each other across barriers of race, class, and circumstance, proving that love truly needed no words, only understanding, respect, and the courage to choose each other again and again, no matter what obstacles the world might place in their path. In the distance, a wolf howled, not with loneliness, but with the pure joy of a creature that had found its mate. The sound echoed off the mountains and was answered by another wolf, then another, until the entire valley rang with their wild celebration of love triumphant. And in a small corner of the Montana territory, two hearts that had learned to speak each other's language without words began writing the first chapter of a story that would be told for generations to come, a story of love that conquered fear, of choice that overcame circumstance, and of two people who proved that the most beautiful conversations happen not with voices, but with souls. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.